Hi everybody, this is Wanda and I just wanted to say welcome to this week's episode of Bible Briefs. I know you're here for the story, so let's get right into it. As God had said through his prophets, 70 years after Babylon conquered Jerusalem, the Persians conquered Babylon. And shortly after this, in 538 BC, King Cyrus, ruler of the Persians, issued a decree that any of the exiled Jews who wished could return to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. He even gave them back all the gold and silver objects the Babylonians had plundered from the temple when they conquered Jerusalem. Within a year or two, over 42,000 Jews moved back to Judah, led by Zerubbabel and Jeshua, the high priest. That autumn, they rebuilt the altar of the temple on its old site and resumed the daily sacrifices prescribed in God's law. And in the spring of their second year there, they hired workers and began rebuilding the temple. When they got the foundations laid, they stopped to praise God for his goodness and enduring love. But many of the people who were old enough to remember Solomon's temple wept at the sight. But the people the Assyrians had resettled in the surrounding lands did everything they could to oppose the rebuilding of the temple, discouraging the people, intimidating them, and bribing those in a position to delay the work. And work on the temple eventually stopped completely. So God sent prophets to the people to stir them to action. On August 29th, 520 BC, God gave this message to Haggai. The people are saying, it's not time to rebuild God's house yet, but look at what's going on. Your crops aren't growing well, you can't get enough to eat or drink, and you go through your money so fast, it's like your pockets have holes in them. Why? Because my house is a ruin while you put all your time and effort into building fancy houses for yourselves. When the people heard God's words, God reinvigorated them for the work, and within a month, they'd resumed building the temple. On October 17th of that year, God sent another message through Haggai. Those of you who remember the former splendor of the temple know that this is so much less than what it was that it seems like nothing. But be strong and keep working, because I'm with you. And in a little while, I'll shake the nations, and all their treasures will be brought to this temple. And the future glory of this temple will surpass its previous glory, and I'll bring peace in this place. I have spoken. Then on December 18th of that year, while work on the temple was still continuing, God sent one final message to the people through Haggai. I'm making a promise now, before you harvest your crops, and while the seed is still in the barns, that from this day on I will bless you. In November of that same year, God gave his first recorded message to the prophet Zechariah, saying, return to me and I will return to you. Don't be like your ancestors who wouldn't listen, but turn away from evil. Remember that everything I said would happen to your ancestors happened just like I said it would. And a few months later, Zechariah started having visions, most of which were promises that God's passion for Jerusalem had been rekindled and his blessing was with his people in rebuilding it. Jerusalem would become so overcrowded there wouldn't be enough room for everyone. More exiles would return, and not just the exiles, but people from many nations would come to follow God, and God would dwell in Jerusalem. In another vision, God told Zechariah that the rebuilding of the temple would be accomplished not by physical strength or worldly power, but by God's Spirit. That Zerubbabel had started the rebuilding and he would finish it, and that they shouldn't despise the small beginnings because God rejoiced to see them get started again. Before the temple was even complete, God had Zechariah remind the people of how he'd always commanded his people to treat each other. Judge fairly, extend mercy and kindness to each other. Don't scheme against each other, and don't oppress the poor, foreigners, or any other vulnerable people. Of course, the enemies who had tried to delay the rebuilding of the temple for years didn't sit by idly. They sent messages to the new Persian king, Darius, asking him to search the records to see if this rebuilding had been authorized. Darius's men found the record of Cyrus' decree to rebuild the temple and commanded the surrounding peoples to support and not hinder the rebuilding. With such support, work progressed quickly, and the temple was completed on March 12th, 515 BC. It was dedicated. The priests and Levites were split into the divisions of service God had commanded through Moses, And when Passover came around on April 21st of that year, the return to exiles celebrated with great joy. God had shown great favor to the Jews who'd returned to Judah, but many Jews had stayed in the lands of Babylon and Persia and prospered there. Darius passed away, and his son Xerxes became king in 486 BC. Sometime during the 3rd year of his reign, he threw a huge party for all his nobles and officials, a party that lasted 6 months. And during this party, a drunk King Xerxes commanded that his queen be brought wearing the royal crown so that all the men at the party could see how beautiful she was. But the queen refused to come. The king was furious and consulted with his advisors as to what the penalty should be. And his advisors pointed out that the queen had wronged every man in the empire, for once word of her behavior got out, women across the empire would stop showing their husbands any respect. So the king should pass an unchangeable law that the queen was permanently banished from his presence, and the king would choose someone else more worthy to replace her. This would ensure that wives throughout the empire would show proper respect to their husbands. And the king followed their advice. But once he'd had a chance to cool off, Xerxes thought about what he had done, and his attendants suggested he appoint agents to gather the most beautiful young virgins from across the empire to be added to his harem. These women would get a year of beauty treatments, and then the king would sleep with each one. And the one he liked best could be the new queen. King Xerxes really liked this idea and put the plan into action. Among all the young women brought to the king's harem was a young Jewish woman named Esther. She'd been raised by her cousin Mordecai, who worked in the palace, and he had told her to keep her heritage a secret. She impressed the chief eunuch over the harem, who treated her favorably. She also impressed the king when she was taken to him, and he liked her best and made her the new queen. Shortly after this, 2 of the king's guards became angry with him and plotted to assassinate him. But Mordecai heard about the plot and passed the information to Esther, who passed it on to the king as a report from Mordecai. When it was found to be true, both of the guards were executed, and the story was recorded in the Chronicle of the Kingdom. Sometime later, the king promoted Haman to be second in command of the empire and commanded that all the other officials bow down to him to show him respect when he passed by. But Mordecai refused to bow and show respect to Haman. Haman was furious, and knowing that Mordecai was a Jew, he determined to destroy all the Jews in the empire. In April of 474 BC, Haman had lots, called Purim, cast to determine the best day to take such an action. And those lots selected March 7th, 473 BC, as the day for Haman to destroy the Jews. So Haman went to King Xerxes and told him that there was a race of people scattered across the empire who kept themselves apart and observed only their own laws and refused to obey the king. It wasn't good to allow them to live, so the king should issue a decree that they be destroyed. And if the king did so, then Haman would donate 375 tons of silver to the royal treasury. The king agreed and gave Haman his ring so Haman could act in his name. And Haman dictated the decree that every single Jew in the empire should be killed on March 7th the next year, and those who killed them could keep their property. The decree was quickly sent throughout the empire. When Mordecai heard of the decree, he went into deep mourning and had to sit at the gate of the palace instead of entering because no one was allowed in the palace while mourning. When Esther sent an attendant to find out what was going on with Mordecai, he passed on the whole story and a copy of the decree and told her that she should intercede for her people with the king. But Esther sent the message back that everyone knew that to go before the king uninvited meant death unless the king held out his scepter in pardon. And the king hadn't called for her in a month. But Mordecai replied, "Don't think that being in the palace is going to keep you safe. If you keep quiet, another means of deliverance will come about, but you and your family will die. This may be the moment you were made queen for." So Esther told him to gather all the Jews in town to fast for her, no food or water for the next 3 days. She and her maids would do the same, then she would go to see the king. 3 days later, Esther put on her royal robes and went to see the king. He held out the scepter to her, welcomed her, and told her that he'd give her anything she asked, up to half the kingdom. All she asked was for the king and Haman to come to a private banquet she would host for them that night. They came, and the king again asked her what she wanted, but she just invited them to come back the next night for another banquet. Then she would tell them what it was all about. Haman left that banquet feeling pretty good until he saw Mordecai sitting at the gate and still not showing him any respect. And then he went home and bragged to his family and friends about his great wealth and power and many honors. But it was all worthless as long as Mordecai could just sit there and not show him respect. And Haman's wife suggested that he have a 75-foot-tall wooden spike set up, and then in the morning he could go to the king and have Mordecai impaled on it. And Haman ordered the spike set up. But that night, Xerxes couldn't sleep. So he had someone read the Chronicle of the Kingdom to him. And he heard the story of how Mordecai had uncovered an assassination plot and saved his life. And he asked what they'd done for Mordecai to reward him. He was told that nothing had been done for Mordecai. About that time, Haman arrived, eager to get permission to execute Mordecai. The king had Haman brought to him and asked what he should do to honor someone he was very pleased with. Well, Haman thought the king must be talking about him, so he said, "You should get a royal robe and a royal horse and have them handed over to one of your high nobles. That noble can put the robe on the man you wish to honor, then put him on the horse and parade him through the city square declaring, 'This is what the king does for someone he wants to honor.'" Xerxes loved the idea and commanded Haman to personally do all of that for Mordecai, and Haman had to do it. Haman returned home humiliated and told his wife and friends what had happened, and they warned him that in light of this, continuing to oppose Mordecai would be fatal. Then it was time for Haman to go to Esther's banquet. After dinner, the king again asked Esther what it was she wanted. And Esther replied that she wanted to have her life spared as well as the life of her people, because they were being given over to those who wanted to destroy them. The king demanded to know who would dare plot against her, and she told him it was all Haman's doing. The king stormed out into the garden. Haman was terrified and knew the king was about to kill him. He stayed to plead with Esther for his life, and in despair fell on the couch where she was reclining just as the king returned. To the king, it looked like Haman was trying to assault Esther, and Haman was immediately seized. Then one of the servants came in and told the king about Haman's 75-foot spike that he wanted to impale the heroic Mordecai on. And the king commanded Haman be executed on it instead. He gave all of Haman's property to Esther, and Esther told the king how she and Mordecai were related. Again, Esther begged the king to reverse Haman's order to destroy the Jews, but once a decree was issued in the king's name, it couldn't be undone. The king told them that, although Haman's order couldn't be revoked, they could use his signet ring to send a new decree of their own devising to the Jews. So on June 25th, Mordecai dictated a new order that said on March 7th, the Jews could unite and defend themselves, killing anyone who attacked them and taking their property. The order was rushed to all parts of the empire, and the Jews celebrated. When March 7th rolled around, the Jews slaughtered all those who hated them and came to destroy them, 75,000 in all. But they didn't take the plunder for themselves. And Mordecai sent a letter to all the Jews advising them to commemorate this event as an annual holiday called Purim after the lots that were used to choose the day. Mordecai was given Haman's position as second in command and continued to work for the good of the Jews throughout the empire. Xerxes was assassinated just 8 years later, and one of his sons, Artaxerxes, became the next king. During that time, there lived a scribe and expert in God's laws named Ezra. In 458 BC, Ezra led another delegation of Jews back to Jerusalem. The king offered his full support. He gave Ezra a letter authorizing any Jews who wanted to return to travel with him. He commissioned Ezra to evaluate the situation in Jerusalem according to God's law, to teach God's law to the people, and to appoint magistrates and judges who would govern the people and see that they obeyed God's law. The king gave Ezra money to purchase sacrifices and free access to the royal treasury for anything that was needed for the temple. The king was so eager to secure God's favor that he even exempted all the temple workers from taxes and tolls and promised to punish any who would not obey God's law. Around 1,700 people traveled with Ezra back to Jerusalem. Ezra hadn't been back long before some of the leaders of the people came to him and told him that the people, and even some of the priests, were marrying foreign women and following the pagan practices of the former inhabitants of the land, much like they had before Babylon conquered them. Ezra was appalled and mourned and prayed right in front of the temple. And a large crowd gathered and mourned for their sin because they'd so quickly abandoned God's commands again. And they swore to God and each other that they would all send away their foreign wives and their children, though so many had married foreign women that it took several months for the process to be completed. Now, towards the end of 446 BC, visitors from Judah arrived in the Persian capital. There they spoke with a Jew named Nehemiah, who was one of King Artaxerxes' most trusted servants, and told him that things weren't going so well in Jerusalem with the exiles. The city walls were still in ruins, and the people were disgraced. When he heard this, Nehemiah mourned, fasted, and prayed for the king's favor for many days. And come spring, this matter still weighed heavily on Nehemiah's heart. So heavy that he couldn't put on a happy face for work, and the king noticed. The king asked him what was troubling him, and Nehemiah explained that he was troubled by the state of Jerusalem, the city of his ancestors, and he would like a leave of absence to go visit and help Jerusalem, and letters from the king giving him authorization to get everything he needed to rebuild the walls. The king gave him what he asked, and also sent some men along to protect Nehemiah on his journey to Jerusalem. Nehemiah didn't tell anyone what his plan was until after he'd personally inspected the walls and seen the shape they were in. Then he went to the leaders and said to them, "Let's rebuild Jerusalem's walls and end our disgrace." But when the foreigners around them heard about it, they accused the Jews of rebelling against the king and mocked them constantly. But the people were not deterred, and soon the wall around the city had been built up to half its height. Then their opposition got really worried and started planning to attack them before they could finish. But Nehemiah made sure everyone was armed at all times, and from then on, half the people stood guard while the other half worked building the wall, and even the half building the wall built the wall with a weapon in one hand. They finished building the wall in 52 days, despite near constant opposition from the other people who lived in the land. 6 days later, they gathered to hear Ezra read God's law to them. The people wept as they realized how great their disobedience was, but Nehemiah and Ezra told them that it was a sacred day, and they should not mourn on such a day, but feast and celebrate, for God's joy was their strength. They also discovered that it was time for the festival of shelters, and so they made temporary shelters and lived in them as God had commanded, and they celebrated as no one had since the days of Joshua, who had led the people into the land. For the 7 days of the festival, they gathered to hear Ezra read God's law to them every day. More sacred assemblies were held in the days that followed, and the people confessed their sins and vowed to obey all of God's laws. Nehemiah later had to return to Persia for a time in service of the king. And when he came back, he found that the people weren't obeying all of God's laws as they'd said they would. Nehemiah did what he had to set things right, but by now you know how this story usually goes, and the people didn't stick to the reforms for long. So before the end of the Old Testament era, God sent one final prophet named Malachi to confront the people with their sins. The charges were these. The people were showing contempt for God by offering the worst and least valuable of their animals as sacrifices instead of the best. The priests weren't faithful in instructing the people. The people were marrying foreign women and breaking their vows to their wives. And they were stealing from God by cheating him out of the tithes the law demanded. Yet God still held out the offer that if the people would return to him, he would take them back. For God himself would come to his temple suddenly, and when he did, the arrogant and wicked would be destroyed like wood in a furnace. But on that day, for those who feared God, the Son of Righteousness would rise with healing in his wings. And on that day, they would go free and jump for joy. And he promised to send the prophet Elijah before that day came to turn the hearts of the fathers to their children and the hearts of the children to their fathers. And that was the last word God gave his people for over 400 years. In time, a young Greek military genius named Alexander conquered the Persians, and Greek culture spread everywhere through this Greek empire. In reaction to Greek culture being forced on them, some Jews devoted themselves to the preservation of the Jewish faith, customs, and traditions. But there was no clear consensus on the best way to do this, and so different sects, such as the Pharisees and Sadducees, emerged. They did what they could to keep the people following God's law, even while a new empire based in Rome was rising. Then in 31 BC, Caesar Augustus defeated the last Greek ruler, uniting the empire and beginning the Pax Romana. But even though they were still under foreign occupation, God had not forgotten his people. He was about to come to them like never before, and in a way no one would have ever imagined. Now that the story's over, it's time for our processing questions. So, here are our processing questions. Feel free to think through them yourself, or if you're listening to this with a group, pause the audio and talk amongst yourselves about these. What did you like about this story? What did you not like or find confusing and uncomfortable in this story? What did you learn about God from this story? What did you learn about people from this story? And what does God want you to do in light of this story? Well, we've completed our mad dash through the Old Testament. I hope it's been useful and that you've learned things and seen connections through this method that you've never noticed before. I know I gained some new insights by doing this. It's been a lot of work in a short time, so although I have some ideas for the future, I'm going to take a break from this for a bit. But I wanted to encourage all of you who have enjoyed this and would like to continue studying the Bible from a story perspective to check out the organization Simply the Story at simplythestory.org. They've got a great training system and offer workshops all over the world to train everyday Christians to lead story-based Bible studies from short passages of Scripture. Also, as always, please like, share, and subscribe so that others can receive benefit from this like you did and to be notified when I start this up again. God bless you all.